In the early 1800s, the most dangerous part of reaching London wasn't the city, it was the final 10 miles. As your carriage rolled through the pitch-black commons of Hounslow, you weren't just watching for masked highwaymen. You were caught in a far more predatory trap. At the time, England had no police. It had thief-takers, private mercenaries who only got paid if they sent someone to the gallows. A criminal was worth more dead than alive, and that legal loophole was killing innocent people. But in 1805, a group of men in bright red waistcoats appeared on these roads to stop the government's blood money system from eating itself alive. In the next 8 minutes, we'll see how Robin Redbreasts forced the law to finally protect the guilty, just to keep the system honest. To understand why London's outskirts were so lethal, you have to forget everything you know about modern safety. Imagine the great roads leading into the city, the veins of the British Empire. By day, they were bustling with trade. By night, they became a vacuum of authority. There were no streetlights, no patrols, and the watchmen of the era were usually elderly men paid to stay in one spot. If you were a merchant carrying gold or a traveler with your life savings, you were entering a no-man's land. The law at the time was purely reactive. The state didn't believe it was their job to prevent you from being robbed. Their job was only to punish the robber after you've been picked clean. This created a landscape where the highwayman wasn't just a news sank, he was a king. But as the bodies piled up and the economy stuttered, the government realized that their hands-off approach was creating a vacuum that was being filled by something much more sinister than a common thief. The crime, the highwayman of the 1800s, wasn't the dashing rogue you see in movies. He was a symptom of a broken system. On the outskirts of London, robbery had become an organized industry. These men knew the carriage schedules better than the drivers, and they knew exactly where the road narrowed or the mud deepened to force a stop. But the crime here wasn't just the theft of a gold watch. It was the atmosphere of total lawlessness that paralyzed the city. It got so bad that people began to carry sacrifice purses, small amounts of money they intended to give up immediately just to avoid being shot. The government was humiliated. They tried to solve the problem by ratcheting up the stakes, passing the Bloody Code, which made over 200 crimes punishable by death. They thought that if they made the punishment terrifying enough, the crime would stop. Instead, they just made the criminals more desperate and gave birth to a new kind of predator who worked within the law to profit from the hangman's noose. The investigation. Because there was no organized police force, the government turned to a system of blood money. They offered massive cash rewards, often £40, a fortune at the time, to anyone who could secure a conviction for a highway robbery. This birthed the thief-taker. These weren't investigators. They were bounty hunters who lived in the filthiest corners of the underworld. Their investigations didn't involve forensics or tracking. They involved betrayal. A thief-taker would often befriend young, desperate men, encourage them to commit a crime, and then immediately turn them in to collect the reward. They weren't cleaning up the streets, they were farming them. To a thief-taker, an actual investigation was a waste of time. It was much easier to manufacture a criminal than to find one. The law had created a machine where the protectors were more incentivized to see a man hang than to see the truth come out. The confession in the courtrooms of the Old Bailey, the word of a thief-taker was gold. Because the law was so desperate to curb the highwaymen, the standard for evidence was terrifyingly low. Usually, the proof consisted of two things: a recovered item, like a watch or a snuff box, and a confession. But these confessions were rarely confessions in the way we think of them today. They were often extracted through improper promises. A thief-taker would tell a terrified suspect, "Confess to this one robbery, name a few accomplices, and I'll make sure the judge goes easy on you." Or, worse, they would plant evidence on an innocent person and threaten them with the gallows unless they signed a statement. The system didn't care about the integrity of the evidence. It cared about the result. As long as a body was swinging at Tyburn by Monday morning, the law felt it was doing its job. The courtrooms weren't seeking truth, they were processing rewards. The legal mistake. The system's fatal flaw was incentivized perjury. By attaching a massive price tag to a human life, The government had inadvertently turned the legal system into a business. The bloody code was supposed to be a deterrent, but in the hands of the thief-takers, it was a menu. The legal mistake wasn't just a lack of oversight. It was a fundamental failure of due process. Because these bounty hunters weren't salaried officials, they had no duty to the truth, only to the transaction. The courts were essentially outsourcing justice to the highest bidder. This created a thief-maker culture where the law was being used as a weapon to commit judicial murder for profit. By the time the 19th century dawned, the British government realized that if they didn't change how the law was enforced on the streets, the public would lose all faith in the courts. They didn't just need more men. They needed a different kind of law. The courtroom turning point. The breaking point arrived when the government realized that the blood money system was making the roads less safe. In 1805, and later reinforced in 1809, the Home Office took a radical step. They stopped relying on mercenaries and established the Bow Street Mounted Patrol. This was a legal revolution disguised as a police force. For the first time, these men were given a salary. It sounds like a small administrative detail, but it was a massive legal turning point. By paying the officers a flat wage, the state effectively severed the link between a conviction and a paycheck. In the eyes of the law, the officer no longer had a financial interest in whether a suspect was found guilty or innocent. This shifted the burden of truth back to where it belonged. The courtrooms began to see a new kind of testimony, not from a bounty hunter looking for a payday, but from a public servant whose job was to maintain order, not just secure a hanging. Then came the red waistcoats. To the modern eye, they look like a fashion choice, but in the 1800s, they were a legal shock to the system. Before this, police work was done in the shadows. You didn't know you were being watched until the handcuffs were on. The Redbreasts flipped the script. They were the first force to use visible deterrence as a legal tool. The twist is that the uniform wasn't just for the criminals. It was a shield for the public. By making the officers impossible to miss, the law was finally identifying itself. You knew exactly who was stopping you, who was questioning you, and who was responsible for your safety. It ended the era of secret justice where a bounty hunter could disappear you into the system for a profit. The bright red waistcoat was a declaration that the state was now accountable for its actions on the highway. For the fur. The legacy of the Robin Redbreasts isn't found in a museum of old uniforms. It's found in every modern courtroom that demands a fair trial. Their creation represents the birth of professionalization. The law finally recognized an uncomfortable truth. If you want a justice system that works, you have to separate the pursuit of criminals from the pursuit of profit. By replacing the bounty hunter with a salaried officer, the state created an invisible shield that protected the citizen. It protected the innocent from being framed for a reward, and it protected the guilty from being processed through a corrupt hanging factory. This shift moved the legal system from retributive justice, where the goal was simply to hurt someone for a crime, to procedural justice, where the way you catch a criminal is just as important as the conviction itself. The red waistcoats taught us that the law's greatest power isn't the ability to punish. It's the ability to remain fair, even when the world outside is dark and dangerous. The Robin Redbreasts eventually faded into history, replaced by the more famous bobbies of Scotland Yard. But the scarlet cloth of their waistcoats left a permanent stain on the legal world. They proved that the law is only as strong as its integrity. When we allow justice to be sold for a bounty, we don't get safety. We get a system that creates the very monsters it claims to hunt. Today, every time an officer identifies themselves, follows a protocol, or receives a steady paycheck instead of a reward, they're upholding the lesson learned on those dark London roads. The law isn't just a set of rules. It's a promise that the system will hold itself to a higher standard than the criminals it pursues. Because in the end, the only thing more dangerous than a highwayman is a state that profits from the crime.